Hi, everyone. As I mentioned before, the lower class of the United States, the late 1800s, is really split into two groups: the farmers, who we looked at yesterday, and today we're looking at industrial workers. And both of these groups will struggle a lot in the late 1800s, but they'll find very different avenues to try to improve their situation. Whereas the farmers will turn to the Populist Party and politics to try to change the system and to find some real places of growth. The industrial workers will instead turn to unions as a way to organize themselves and gain some power in that way. And so, as a quick review, at this point, there are millions of Americans in a growing number, a growing percentage, living in cities, working in these factories with dangerous conditions, low pay, long hours, and really pretty miserable work as well as we move in the direction of the assembly line. We're not quite to the famous moving assembly line of Henry Ford, but we're getting closer and closer to it. It wasn't the breakthrough some people make it out to be. It was really a process as we move to that more industrialized, low skilled labor rather than craftsmen building something from start to finish. Every task is broken up into small parts and then done over and over and over again by these unskilled workers. And there's a lot of workers between immigration from abroad, especially from Eastern and Southern Europe with those new immigrants, and then a lot of farmers also leaving the farm, as we talked about, because they have moved towards machines and they're struggling so much as well to make ends meet. They're losing their farms through foreclosures. So many workers means low wages because if it's easy to find someone to take this job, no matter what the wage is. So as an individual, there's very little ability to negotiate. You have very few skills. There's so many people willing to take this job. It's tough to ask for a raise or better treatment under those conditions. And so that will push them to unionize, to form these groups. Together, perhaps they would have a chance to make demands for better treatment. But divisions within the lower class, again, will be really devastating to try to for those trying to make improvements, not just from within the farmers and the industrial workers, but within industrial workers, especially ethnic divisions, racial divisions will be capitalized on by the owners realizing they can turn one group against the other. Too early, the two big unions at this time, you don't need to memorize the differences between them, but just at least recognize the name. And we should be thinking then, all right, union, late 1800s, the Knights of Labor is one very famous one that will be around for a few decades. And then more successful than them is the AFL. And again, a name you should recognize at least. Samuel Gompers is a name you should recognize as just a union leader at this time. But again, those divisions, another division is skilled versus unskilled. The skilled laborers, they already have some negotiating power because they have a skill. They're tougher to replace. And so it'll be a division there of, are they going to work together with those unskilled laborers who they maybe look down on a little bit? But those divisions as well are already a difficult part for these unions. But the AFL will eventually include about 1/3 of all US laborers, so obviously a pretty huge organization. But as those unions grow, corporations have a lot of tactics to try to maintain power because they did have most of the power going in and they'll have most of the power going out of the 19th century. The government, we'll look at an example with the Pullman strike, will almost always side with the corporations at this time. They can always hire strike breakers, other workers, known as scabs sometimes, and these were hated by people going on strike. You're going on strike, that means you're sacrificing things, you're not getting paid. It's definitely a difficult time, but they say this sacrifice is necessary short term to have long term improvements. Those that are then brought in to replace them, they were hated and often attacked, sometimes beaten, sometimes killed. This is another chance when the owners will capitalize on divisions, ethnic divisions, bringing in a different immigrant group, sometimes bringing in African Americans. And that really increases some of the racial divisions between white and black workers. When black workers who are so desperate for jobs are brought in as scabs during those strikes. Yellow dog contracts, which is something that a worker would have to sign at the beginning to say they will never join a union, to try to stop them from ever getting started in the first place. And generally, when a strike happens, everyone is losing. The company is not making money because there's a shutdown. The workers aren't making money because they're stopped working. So no one's winning. The question is, who can make these sacrifices for longer? Who can go longer without making any money? And generally, the companies are going to be able to outlast the strikers. They've got money on their side. They can last a few months with a factory shutdown, if that's to prove their point, to stop the union. For the workers who are struggling before, it's going to be really tough for them to make it months, perhaps, without a paycheck. And so that's one way, is just wait them out. And then company towns. Again, we'll look at the Pullman strike in a moment as a great example of this. This is where the company that has the factory also often owns the houses, they own the store, they control everything. And that makes it really tough to do something like go on strike, because now you have not just lost your job, that might mean you're also losing your house as well, as you are forced out of those company towns. And they'll also be pretty successful at the propaganda campaign, you might call it, of trying to convince a lot of people that these unions are un-American, that this is leaning a little bit towards communism or a little bit towards socialism, and that this is being brought over by immigrants. And there's also certainly an anti-immigrant feeling in the late 1800s, and trying to convince workers not to join unions by claiming that it is simply un-American to do so. As I said, one specific example, there's a lot of big strikes during this time period, and we'll do a class activity to look at a few more of them, but one we should know, one of the most famous ones is the Pullman strike. At the Pullman Palace Car Company, they made these railroad cars, which was big business in the 1890s, the age of railroads. And they made these really nice ones. This was a company town outside of Chicago. They had the factory, they controlled everything. Pullman, George Pullman, the owner of the Pullman Car Company, the town really, he had complete control over. It was a town where he was pretty much the dictator of. They were not allowed to have saloons. He said there was temperance, a big temperance movement at this time. Prohibition's only a few decades away. No one's allowed to drink alcohol. You have to live in these houses, but you can't buy these houses. These are rented out from the company, so they still have that control over it. And in some ways, it was really nice. It was a nice town. It was nice housing. They had decent schools, but it was pretty complete control for George Pullman. And on the other side of that will be Eugene Debs, a very important person. That is someone you should know by name, and his union of 150,000 railway workers against the Pullman Car Company, that company town. And in a depression, there's a depression in 1893 that we know happened from time to time. Times are tough. And so the Pullman Car Company, they cut wages by a third. But this is a tricky situation now because he also controls rent. And so he decides rent will stay the same, although wages are cut. And that's what we see with this cartoon here. For the workers, this is certainly quite a bind to be losing your salary or a third of your salary, but still have the same expenses. And I think we can understand that they're going to be upset over this. This will be a major strike, not just affecting this town, and the city, the Pullman city, but across the country. It will become a secondary strike as those Pullman workers stop working. Other railway workers across the country, they'll kind of say, you know, if Pullman wins this and he's able to do this, is my company going to do the same thing to me? And so they refuse to pull these Pullman cars. And this is very common. These Pullman cars were incredibly common. And so this will bring railroad traffic across the country to a bit of a halt as these other railroad workers strike in solidarity. Again, thinking that they are kind of on the same team here. It is trying to form that cooperation there. Eventually, as I mentioned before, the federal government will intervene. They will argue that the federal mail is being stopped now. Mail is being shipped by train at this time as well, because so many train cars have been stopped. And this was by design. This was a pretty clever thing by the railroad companies. They wanted the federal government to get involved. How do we force the federal government to get involved? We put rail cars on the same train as Pullman cars. The railroad workers stopped pulling it. Now they're stopping the mail. That's a federal crime. Now the government has to get involved. And a famous quote there from President Cleveland, if it takes the entire army to deliver a postal card, it's going to get delivered. And he will send in federal troops to arrest the leaders, including Eugene Debs, and force an end to this strike. Debs is arrested and spends 6 months in jail. He will be arrested again later for speaking out against World War I. But that's to come. This will further divide the country quite a bit. For the workers, it seems like now the federal government is not government by and for the people, as Abraham Lincoln famously said. It is government by and for the Pullman Company. This is now acting against, bringing down a lot of hundreds of thousands of workers. And so this will create some real national turmoil, and we'll have to keep that in mind when we cover the 1896 election, that this had happened just the year before. Like I said, many workers seeing government and corporations working together to keep them down. And some will turn more radical. Eugene Debs goes from a union leader who stresses nonviolent protests and that strikes should be reasonable discussions between workers and the owners. He will turn into a socialist after this, and he'll turn increasingly more radical, thinking that the deck is just so stacked against the workers at this time. This would be your question to make sure we understand this idea. Sometimes this would happen. Unions and owners, they would bring together this third party, a neutral group, to kind of look at everything and say, all right, what is a fair balance here? What's a fair solution to both sides? Try and have someone not quite as involved. And so I'll ask you to think about that a little bit. That's the end of the video for today. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you later.